Everybody, welcome to the Building Excellence Podcast. I've got Aaron Hill with me, who's a professor at the University of Florida. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
It's an honor.
absolutely. Well, you got a unique story, being obviously in basketball and then now in the academic world. If you wouldn't mind, kind of give people some background as where you grew up and what that was like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up, I guess, where I'm from, we call it the Inland Northwest. So, I say, hey, I'm from Washington, and people say DC, and then like, no, the state. And then they say Seattle, like, no, like
Keep
four
going.
hours inland. Um, so I grew up near Spokane. Part of my life in northern Idaho. Part of my life outside Spokane. Um, and my dad was an old coach and then was in athletic sales, had like a sporting goods store. So that was kind of my upbringing, was all about sports, which was awesome. Unfortunately, the dream of playing in the NBA or Major League Baseball didn't quite make it. That's how it goes. But I went to college in Gonzaga, which was maybe about 40 minutes from where I grew up, and wanted to play, but it wasn't quite good enough. So ended up working with the program for 4 years during my undergrad time there, and then stayed on at the university. I was a graduate assistant in some capacities with basketball, and then with baseball as well. Then transitioned into fundraising for the university for a few years. So did athletic fundraising mostly on selling sponsorship packages, that type of thing. At that time, Gonzaga was building a new arena, so really working on the new arena, which is a fantastic experience. Uh, did that for a few years, and honestly, just and maybe we'll get into this. I loved the coaching side. Like, I love the aspect of working as a team and competition. I didn't love the recruiting side of things. And I would say the same with fundraising. I loved working towards a goal, but I didn't necessarily love kind of asking people for money and being in some ways beholden.
Yeah.
So kind of didn't really know what I wanted to do, and had some professors at Gonzaga like, well, you're smart. You should try being a professor. So I really just kind of jumped into it blind. I figured, what's the worst case? I'm pretty young. If it doesn't work, I'll do something else, or at least I've got a degree.
Yeah.
Uh, so it was really just honestly kind of blind luck. And, I did like very little research in the process. I talked to a few professors. One of them had a friend at Oklahoma State, so he said, "Hey, you should apply at Oklahoma State." So I was very late. Like, typically, people apply like say around Christmas time, and this was like April, so I'd already missed all the other application deadlines. And it was basically like I had a very quick phone conversation with the guy at Oklahoma State. He's like, "Yeah, sure, you could start in the fall." Pretty informal. So that was it. I ended up at Oklahoma State. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's go back real quick into your time growing up in Eastern Washington and northern Idaho. What I mean, you had some siblings, right? Did you guys all play
Yeah.
sports growing up, and what was that like? And what sports did you play, and how do you feel like those things shaped you at an early age?
Yeah. I have one older brother, and he's almost 2 years older in age, but only 1 year in school,
Okay.
which is the way all that worked, I guess. Then I grew up. My mom is from a family of five siblings, and I grew up with all of her brothers and sisters' kids, so almost like extended. Some of them are almost brother or sister esque.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up playing a lot of sports with them, or we were just playing sports all the time. So I, kind of nonstop as a little kid. Like, you just go from mini mod soccer to, okay, now it's cold basketball. Okay, now it's
Yeah.
warm baseball. Hey, there's a wrestling thing. Go wrestle.
Yeah.
My parents just kept us active pretty much year round doing something.
Mm-hmm.
Which was great. So yeah, youth sports. I pretty much played all the youth sports. We didn't have tackle football, but played flag football for a little while. Uh, yeah, and then as you get older, uh, I went to a pretty small high school, so we were like maybe 300 students, which was awesome in many ways because it afforded me the opportunity to play in all three sports.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I didn't have to, maybe some of the bigger schools I would have had to drop one or maybe even two. So in high school, I played football, basketball, and baseball, which was a fantastic experience.
Yeah. Looking back, what are some things you feel like you learned through playing those sports that really helped you as you progressed in life?
So yeah, I've had this conversation a lot lately, mostly because we just had a baby. So my wife and I are already thinking about, like, it just changes everything, right? Like you're watching a movie and there's like a sports injury in gymnastics. You're like, well, maybe gymnastics is not a good sport, right? So half joking,
Yeah.
but we both agree that just getting our child active teaches so many life lessons. Some sports I was better than other sports at, and I think both sides of that coin are really important. That you can learn how to be relatively good at something and be humble about it. Because you can also learn to be relatively bad at something, but also contribute, right?
Mm.
You know, and I think maybe my dad being a coach instilled a lot of that. Like, you may only play 1 minute, but you better play hard for that 1 minute, and the other, 31 minutes, you better be playing hard on the bench. I mean, like be an active teammate, be into the game, that type of stuff. So I think sports really instills a lot of those just general life lessons, right? How to, especially team sports. Like, there's sometimes the team wins because you played well. There's sometimes the team wins despite you playing bad.
Yeah.
There's sometimes like you're really no part of any of the success or failure. You're just there.
Hmm.
And I think all of those things are really good life lessons that you can contribute, you can be a detriment. Uh, so I think those are really just life lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. So, did your dad, being a coach, was he connected to Gonzaga? Did he go to Gonzaga, or how did you guys transition to Gonzaga? Was it just because it was close, and obviously they had a great basketball program too?
Yeah, it
Um,
was honestly, it was dumb luck. Um, I think back sometimes in life, a lot of things are just kind of fortuitous. Like, you make these decisions with limited information at the time, and then you make the best of it. So at the time, I had actually considered going to the Air Force Academy, and I thought, okay, like the practical side of my brain said, hey, this is free school, and it's world class education, and you're guaranteed a job when you get out, right? Like, it's not a bad thing. Um, so I actually met with the congressperson and was going down the thing, and I failed the eye test. So I wanted to be a pilot. And yeah, I failed the depth perception, which probably explains some of my baseball skills. So and that just kind of changed trajectory. I considered playing sports at some smaller schools, like D3. Uh, and I think one thing I was really thankful with is both my high school basketball coach and my dad were supportive, but kind of practical about it. Like, hey, you can go there and have a great time, but you're basically free labor. Like, at some point, the fun has to stop, right? Like, are you going to go pay for 3 years of extending this dream, right? So kind of decided, yeah, that's some really good advice. And looking back, it's hard to hear, right? Like, hey, maybe it's time to give it up. But it was probably the best advice I received in a lot of ways, or among the best. Like, maybe this isn't, the NBA isn't in your future. So maybe consider, are there other paths by which you can get through college without debt? So I applied to Gonzaga actually kind of really late. And it just was never really on my radar because all I had thought about was where can I go play basketball. Uh, so I applied kind of late simply because it was local, and I didn't want to go to the local state school. Like, everyone was doing that. Nothing wrong with that, but it just kind of wasn't me. So I didn't. First of all, I don't like Washington State University,
Okay.
so I was like, I'm not applying there. I didn't even think about the University of Washington. I have no idea why. Like, it's a fantastic school.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, it's an awesome campus. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was really just kind of like, I'm going to play at Gonzaga. It's 40 minutes away. Uh, and I think they had, so I was raised Catholic. So, they had probably had my name from a database, and they sent stuff like, hey, you can get scholarships. And so it was actually, it was less than the state school. Like by the
Okay. Yeah.
time, scholarships and that stuff kicked in. So it was really kind of, it was really thoughtless, sadly. It
Yeah.
was like, oh,
Yeah.
this seems good. All right.
Yeah. But you also, looking back, just what you talked about, you had your dad and people around you that were able to give you a little dose of reality, but did it with some grace, but also,
Yeah.
were truthful and honest about it. And so, like you said, that being some of the best advice or just life, um, life advice to as you move forward. Because as you look
Yeah.
back in your life too, one of the things that I find really interesting is, how do you keep the mindset of either pressing in and moving forward towards a certain goal, or maybe it's time to pivot and then change direction. And so
Yeah.
there's no common knowledge or certain way to do that. Everyone has to do it differently, and you process information. You try to have people around you that speak, truth and a little bit of grace to you at the same
Yeah.
time, and then to move forward in the best direction that you can at the time. And so it's really interesting to hear how that all works and comes about. And sometimes it is a little bit of dumb luck. Sometimes it is a little bit of, having a goal in mind and pressing into it, or maybe just a pivot because it's not going to work out in the way that you might want it to, and so you just change that goal or that direction. So it's kind of
Right.
interesting you say that about having people around you that were able to tell you that, and obviously went to Gonzaga. And
Yeah.
as you
I
got
think
to
that's a big factor. Is So I've thought about some of the topics of listen to your podcast, and I've thought about some of these related topics just over the last several years. And I think one of the biggest factors is the people around you, right? Like, there is no roadmap of, many different roadmaps can end in success, but the people around you kind of being the right type of people, in terms of, being the people who pursue excellence, being people who will speak truth with grace. Those are really huge things. So I felt fortunate that, you know, not only my immediate family, but other people that I looked up to, were those type of people that kind of at least help you along the way, right? Support with a little bit of a foot in the ass too. Like,
yeah.
like,
Yeah. Well, so real quickly, just kind of still touching on before you get into college, were there any experiences that shaped you? I mean, you talk about a few of them, but ones that you remember that really shaped you at a young age?
I think most of the experiences I think about are being part of something else. So a lot of it, is probably narrowly focused on sports, but I think also like being in a band and being, I wasn't really like in drama, but like we had to do like a semester of, like, you had to be in the theater, right?
Sure.
And I think those are tremendous experiences. Just, broadening your horizons and being part of something. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like, then I go into academic study, right? And a lot of, there's pretty strong social effects of just all of our behaviors. So I think those are the really formative experiences that I can think of, or is, uh, kind of group things, like just hanging out with my buddies as a kid. I was fortunate that I grew up in a neighborhood with kids my age, probably through steering of my parents, probably in some way. I've never really asked them about it. But kids with, good values. It's not that we were perfect and didn't get in trouble, but, you know,
Mm-hmm.
we weren't off doing crazy stuff. We were all had similar things going on. So I think those are the formative events.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about your parents. How did your parents help shape you growing up as you look back?
I think in every way. So, going into academic study, like, okay, what explains the variance in people's behavior? Like, the evidence is it's roughly 50-50. Like 50% of it is like your nature, like your personality, you're born a certain way. That explains the way you are. And 50% of it is your nurture, right? Like how you're raised, the people you're around. Uh, and that either, suppresses the bad parts of your nature or accentuates the good parts of your nature, right? So I think my parents really just instilled a core set of values and behaviors, uh, that at least guide, like, hey, this is how I should go about life. And I'm not going to be perfect, but when I'm not perfect, I can own up to it. I can accept responsibility. When I am maybe perfect, or when I do well at something, I can, you know, act like a civil human being and be humble about it. So I think it's really just that guidance of this is how you should go about life. These are the way we do things. And I think that's just in every, in every walk of life that you do. My dad was a very like tough man. Like, hey, if you're said you're going to be somewhere at 6, then you're going to be there at 6. Like that's what you said, and if that's your word, and kind of instilled those kind of core hard work, resiliency, the value of your word. I mean, it's hard to encapsulate. You try to like, how do we narrow this down? Like the cowboy code is 10 things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are 10 great things. Like, how do you narrow it down? But those types of things, just kind of instilling a certain way of being, I think.
Absolutely. Well, as you got to college, you're at Gonzaga, and so obviously you got involved in the basketball program, and I want to talk about that. But the Gonzaga that you were involved in is was on the way to being where it is today. It's a little bit different
Yeah,
now, but
absolutely.
a lot of the people were in place there. And talk about how you got involved with the basketball program, and why did you get involved and what that was like.
Yeah. So when I grew up, we were, like I said, 30, 40 minutes from Spokane. My dad worked near the university. He was involved in a sporting goods store. Maybe some similar to Dupree in Stillwater. I mean, a little
Mm-hmm.
bigger, but they did team sales, and so he sold, shoes and uniforms and T-shirts to Gonzaga. So he knew the coaches, which kind of got me in the door with working with them because I thought I want to be a coach. But even before that, like we had season tickets, and I don't even think it was season tickets. It was like they needed people to fill the gym, so they looked like a Division I program, right? It was like, um, and it's so hard to envision where they are today versus where they were. But I grew up basically going to as many games as we could, and eventually it conflicted with high school um, schedule. But we would go on like the Thursday night game. So I remember, for example, watching Hank Gathers and Bo Kimball play. I would have been about 9, maybe 10. Doug Christie when he was at Pepperdine. Ooh, we went to a lot of games there. So in that respect, I was a Gonzaga fan. When I was in high school, they started to be pretty good. Uh, so about 92, which I would have been in 8th grade, they started, like, they made the NIT, they won the WCC, and they started to climb. Their first NCAA tournament, I was a junior in high school. And that year they actually weren't, that wasn't one of their better teams. Maybe they finished 3rd or 4th in the league, but got hot at the right time, made the NCAA tournament. Uh, then the next year, maybe NIT. Uh, so my freshman year at Gonzaga, they were pretty good, but they were nowhere near what they were today. I mean, they still weren't filling their gym. It was still pretty small. Matter of fact, the president at the time, my sophomore year, so my freshman year, they had an interim university president. Uh, the other president was kind of ousted unceremoniously. Uh, and so the new president came in and he was considering moving them down to D3. Like,
Oh, really?
should we be a Division I program? This is like fall of '97, so this would have been spring of '98. Uh, he gets hired and he's kind of going through this. How would we transition to D3? Is that something we should consider? Because there's a number of kind of religious schools in the area, many Catholics, so they would fit, right? And then that spring, so my sophomore year, we get hot, go to the Elite Eight, and money starts pouring in. Applications go up, and it was like, wait a second, maybe we should not do that. Uh, so in that respect, it was kind of just fortuitous luck that the university, good things happened at the right time for them. Otherwise, they could have transitioned down. And some of that was just financial constraints at the university. It was a pretty small school, like 3,000 students when I went there. I think it's almost doubled in terms of undergrads now. So
hmm Wow, that's as you hear that, it's drastically changed a little bit, and it's interesting how that happened right about the time that he took over because obviously they might have transitioned to Division 3, and
Yeah,
who knows what would have happened. But
right.
obviously they stayed in Division 1 and obviously have had tremendous success.
Yeah, it's
But
transformed the university.
and there's
Just
a lot of factors that weigh in when you do well in athletics, especially let's just say the NCAA tournament. Like you get a lot of publicity, notoriety, and it really helps the university in terms of marketing and branding and
absolutely.
having new students apply and see the university. So it's a great tool to kind of expand the horizons for the university as well. So
Yeah.
obviously that turned out very well, but it's interesting. That's an interesting story. So you got there, mid to late '90s. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was a freshman in 1997.
Okay.
So the 1998, 97, 98 basketball season. And we had a pretty good team. We won the league. Uh, and we won the WCC and lost in the WCC title game to go to the NCAA tournament. And then we went to the NIT. Uh, we won a game at Wyoming. We went to Hawaii and lost a close game. Uh, so a really good team. Had a couple guys who were kind of NBA types. Uh, I think Bakari Hendricks maybe had a 10-day contract. Richie Fromm, is a good friend of mine, played. I think he played 6 years in the NBA. Matt Santangelo was a training camp guy. So Casey Calvary was a training camp guy. So had a pretty good team. Just didn't get the benefit of the doubt on Selection Sunday. And then the next year, just got hot at the right time. Obviously had a really talented team, but also some of it is just do you play well at the right time.
And who was the coach at the time?
So my freshman and sophomore year were Dan Munson, and Dan actually his first year was my first year. So he took over for Dan Fitzgerald, who was a longtime coach and athletic director. So Dan was kind of the heir apparent and took over. And then after we got hot in the Elite Eight, he actually took the Minnesota job, which we played them in the first round. So um, I don't want to be disrespectful to Dan because I have the ultimate respect for him, but I think it was like he was maybe like the seventh person they offered the job to, right? So Minnesota was coming off that academic scandal.
Okay.
If you remember that, like they'd gone to the Final Four, and it turns out they were like writing papers for the players, and so they had fired Clem Haskins that year. So we played them round one, and they actually had a few guys suspended round one in the NCAA tournament. So Dan took that job. And then Mark Few became head coach for my second 2 years
Okay.
and is still there.
Yeah. We'll talk about, Coach Munson getting a chance to learn under him as they were obviously kind of just they're breaking into, as people would say, success.
Yeah.
But they had developed a culture and built a culture. And then all of a sudden, he takes a job. And any transition is interesting because always there's a new coach that comes in, whether or not he's on the staff before or from a different university, there's
Yeah.
going to be some transition in leadership and things are going to be done a little bit differently. What did you see from Coach Munson compared to Coach Few? And then also maybe talk about the change from Coach Few from an assistant to then a head coach.
Yeah. So those are two really good questions. So I think it probably helped Dan transitioning in because he had a little bit of the heir apparent type setup. So they knew this was happening. So he kind of an internal takeover or an internal transfer. And I think the world of Dan. First of all, he treated me tremendously well when I was kind of manager. Didn't necessarily. So his dad was a basketball coach, so he had that going, but he didn't play college basketball.
Really?
No, matter of fact, he played football at Idaho in some capacity, maybe like a year or two. But he kind of brought that football player mentality. Just kind of he's a grinder, he's a bulldog, whatever you want to say. But yeah, Dan is a fantastic guy. He's really funny. Kind of a dry sense of humor. Like you better not have a thin skin,
Okay.
which is great. I was kind of raised that way, so it didn't phase me. It did phase some people because you don't necessarily know how to take it, right? Like, is he joking? Is he not?
Yeah.
Uh, And I think so. He took the Minnesota job late. Like I said, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. Like they offered it to a few other people, but it was kind of
Sure.
it was kind of in shambles, right? Like, are they going to be on NCAA probation? So I think he took the job in like August,
Real late. Very late.
very, very late. Yeah, either that or So it actually probably had to be late July. So I have a funny. So we were having basketball camp when they named Mark head coach. So Mark's going for his press conference, and they have it in a they had like they call it the Bulldog room, which is a fairly nice like hospitality room, post game type room. And so we have basketball camp going on, and they have this thing set up where Mark's going to do his press conference, and one of my buddies is driving like the camp van, right, taking teams around. And he decides he's going to pull up. If you've been to Gonzaga, used to be a long driveway to get to the gym. So rather than park in the parking lot and walk, he's going to drive the van up, and he ends up hitting one of the lights, like one of the I don't know, street lights, right?
Sure.
And it knocks out power in the middle of the press conference.
No way.
Like right as it's starting out, yeah. So the start of Fuse press conference is like, "Hey, stop! Can you re-say that?"
Really?
Yeah. So every once in a while, when I talk to my buddy, I'm like, "Remember the press conference?"
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Coach Few got off to a great start
got
early on.
a very good start. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So and Mark obviously has done tremendous, and I put a lot of the success of Gonzaga really honestly on him. Just his mentality, his so since you've been to campus, you kind of see the building, and like Mark didn't accept limitations. Like if there's anything I learned from him, it's like you can dream and you can pursue that dream, and you don't have to say, well, we're just a WCC team, we're just a small school in Spokane, we can't get the top recruits. Like those were those would have been fighting words kind of with Mark. Like, why would you think that? Why would you want to be part of something that thinks that way?
Hmm.
Uh, so just his dogged determination and insistence, I think, really is the number one factor. And then the administration, I think, rightfully just kind of stayed out of his way. Right? They're like, hey, this guy's doing fine. Like, don't mess with success. Uh, and that takes some good leadership, because right, people could, hey, I can make this better. I can put my like. They just stayed out of Mark's way. But it's really the story of Gonzaga's rise is partially Dan Munson, but
Hmm.
is I don't like it's Mark Few
Yeah.
in
Mark.
my opinion.
Sure. Well, as an assistant coach, did you know that he would be a great head coach, or what are the things you saw as he was an assistant, and then as he's been a head coach now? You talked a little bit about what you think, but also what are some leadership things that you learned from him? But first, as an assistant.
So that's kind of an odd transition, right? When you're an internal, when you're an assistant, and then you get thrust, because just your entire role changes, right? Like,
Hmm.
and I don't like good cop, bad cop, right? The head coach, in some respects, has to be the bad cop. They're the ones that the decision falls on. They're, the ultimate face. And so Dan Munson very much, that was his role, right? So he was tough, he was demanding, and when Mark was an assistant, he could kind of be the soft guy, right? Like, hey, what he's really trying to say is this. Like, so Mark was kind of, in some respects, the player's coach, and that role changes when you become the head coach, right? So I think initially, Mark was a little bit lucky that he had an experienced team. So when he took over, I think he had basically all five starters back from the year before. Two guys left, and a key bench player left. So we lost three good players, but had three starters who were upperclassmen. We had kind of the sixth man who was an upperclassman. So he inherited an experienced team who knew him. I think that definitely helped him with the transition, because I think it would be a tough going from the good cop to, hey, I got everything I do has to change, right? So it was helpful to him, but I think he's just a special guy. Like some, I used to say like maybe there's 20% of coaches who are maybe just better coaches, and there's 20% who are just overmatched, and then the middle are like, yeah, they're good coaches, but they're not. There's nothing special about him. I think there's something special about him. Like he clearly has been really successful. He has something.
Mm-hmm.
That's some of it I think is he's pretty sharp with X's and O's. That helps, but there's a lot of good X's and O's coaches, right?
Sure.
I think he's pretty good on the motivation side. I certainly haven't spent a lot of time directly with him, but in many years. But when I was with him, he changed, from assistant to head coach, and I think he did a great job. I mean, it's a tough transition. I think he's got an interesting background. His dad's a preacher, so he kind of has that philosophical. He's a cerebral guy in that respect, but he also was a college baseball player, so he kind of has that baseball player grittiness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not like he just has it. Like the combination is he's clearly just really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to have vision as a leader, like you talked about before, not accepting any limitations. I think that's a big factor as a leader because if you let those things hinder you, saying we're just a West Coast Conference school and let's just play for a championship for the West Coast Conference. Well, obviously, he had a little different mindset. He's like, we're going to do that, but we're also going to play for a national championship. And they've gotten there within
Right.
the last couple of years for sure. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of different characteristics of great head coaches, and obviously having that background of being a great visionary, being a great people person, letting people know that you care, but also having great X's and O's and understanding how to put the right people in place is really important. And obviously, it looks like he's been able to do that. So really cool that you got to be around two, great guys in college basketball and watch them succeed, and really even just to watch from your experience at being at Gonzaga early on, what a cool place to watch and see as that culture was built and established and as it grew. And then you talk about being on the fundraising team that helped fundraise the new arena. So you've seen kind of the process from early on to, and then
Yeah.
even going back when you're a little kid watching the game. So
Right.
really fun
Yeah.
for you.
Some of my high school buddies and I talk about like we used to walk up and sit like pretty good seats and no one said anything, right? Like,
Yeah.
hey, do you want to go to the game tonight? Like, it was like, yeah, pretty amazing, right? And to today, it's like it's just night and day.
Always sold out. Yeah, absolutely.
Same with the guys I went through college with, like reflecting just how much things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like when we went to the NCAA tournament the first time, there was a rule that your practice jerseys, if you had shorts and tops, the numbers had to match, right? Uh, we didn't have that.
Really?
It's like we got new practice stuff for the NCAA tournament because we had practice jerseys that said Gonzaga with your number, but we had just generic shorts, right? So we got like new practice jerseys. And some of that was, I think, Nike wanted to help us out, maybe make us look good. Yeah, little things like that. Uh, like we got, we'd get team issued sweatpants, right? We had to give them back, right? Like,
Really?
hey, check your sweatpants in. Uh,
Yeah.
guys, still like bust our chops about that. Like,
That
hey,
doesn't.
remember when you tried to take my sweatpants? Like, hey, man, I was just doing my job, right? Like,
Yeah. So they actually get to keep their sweatpants now at Gonzaga?
I'm guessing, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I would hope so. I would bet. So
yeah.
anyway, lots changed. But, through those experiences that you had there, are there any fun experiences that you had while on staff at Gonzaga, or actually as a manager within your time there? And then, talk about being a GA for a little bit too.
Yeah, I was really fortunate in that. First of all, Munson treated me tremendously well and let me do more stuff because I wanted to be a coach, and I told him, I'd kind of like to. So he, let me initially like, hey, can you cut down film? Can you do this? So I ended up taking on more and more tasks. Like one year, I helped with the schedule, which was cool. So the year after the Elite Eight run, uh, I called pretty much every BCS school and called their basketball office. Was like, hey, we'd like to schedule a game. We're willing to come to your place. And the people are like, they either wouldn't return the call, or some of the people are like, "Are you crazy? Like, why would we schedule you?" Right? And
Yeah.
they were being funny, but it was like, yeah, no, we're not. You guys come in here and beat us. Like that's not going to be good.
Yeah.
So he let me. So Dan started letting me do stuff like that, and Mark kind of let me keep going. So by the end, I was like basically in charge of road trips in some respects, like meals. I didn't do hotels, but some of that type stuff. So by the end, I was essentially what I guess now would be maybe an operations director.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Tommy Lloyd was in kind of the same capacity. So Tommy uh, started after the Elite Eight run. So he started the next year, so my junior year, and he was like subbing part time. Like he was doing his student teaching, and then coming into the office like after student teaching was done. So kind of
Really?
jumped on board too. Yeah. Um, so he kind of got his teeth cut as a volunteer as I was kind of taking on more admin stuff.
And for those that don't know, Coach Lloyd he became the head coach at Arizona not too long ago. So going from subbing and being an early guy at Gonzaga, now he's at Arizona. Pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
I think he was coaching like seventh grade football, getting done at 4:30 and then coming down and like practice would start. He'd miss the start of practice, right? Like
Wow.
driving his I can still picture his car. Yeah, so like he was just working his ass off,
Mm-hmm.
lack of a better term, but getting his feet cut. So yeah, it was an awesome time because like we didn't have all the stuff, so we got to do a lot of. We didn't have a staff, so it was basically the four coaches. And then they had Tommy and I.
Really? Yeah. So
So
as you get into being a GA, what were the things you were doing, and as you're thinking about coaching, did you start to realize that you didn't want to coach, or were you like, I'm all in for coaching?
so they started doing more and more stuff with like recruiting and some of that stuff, and that's the part that just I didn't like, and I think it's probably even gotten worse. I don't know. Even at that stage. So Mark was, like I said, he didn't accept like, hey, we should recruit this guy, right? So we're trying to get big guys. And with that, there was kind of the AAU culture, which I think has evolved even more. But you had these like hangers honors, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
that were like the third party who's trying to like, hey, is my guy gonna get playing time? Like, I don't know. Like, is he good? Like, is he gonna
Yeah.
come here and is he gonna compete? Is he the right type of guy? So some of that stuff just kind of was distasteful. And I think the culture of people who are really high end athletes, in some respects, at some times, they get babied all throughout the process, right? So like, it's not their own fault in some respects, but they like come with a handout, right? Some of those interactions are like, this just isn't for me. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I just decided kind of, and some of it honestly was lifestyle. Like even at age, so I would have been 20, 21, you start realizing like it's a grind to be a coach. And it's gotten better because they've restricted the recruiting period in the summer. But those guys were gone basically all summer, right? Like they're out recruiting. So that school starts in like August or late August. So they have like 6 weeks where life is maybe normal. And then the basketball season starts, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
like when do they have family time? When do they So I was thankful that I got some exposure to that and said, yeah, this isn't really what I'm looking for in a life. Nothing like that's awesome for those that do it. It just wasn't, like I wanted a little different balance.
Mm-hmm.
So those two factors kind of said, hey, maybe this isn't for me.
Sure. And at the time, your brother is still a coach. Was he coaching too at the time?
So he probably by the time I was a junior, maybe he got his first job. So I've got it's not that long ago. I'm trying to think. So he
Yeah.
worked at Whitworth, which is a Division III school in Spokane. Then he got a job at an NAIA school, Lewis Clark State, then Eastern Washington, then Montana. So yeah, so he would have been doing the same type stuff. And we never really. talked about it, I guess it probably would have been good to reflect on like, hey, here's what I'm seeing.
Sure. Yeah.
Just didn't really stop to, right? Like it just kind of somewhere clicked like, hey, this really isn't how I want to spend my time.
Sure. Yeah. So you're on staff as a GA. You transition into fundraising. What was that like as you get out of playing for, or not playing for, but just being on staff and getting into a little different environment?
So some of that was kind of dumb luck too, right? So Gonzaga was growing and they knew they needed support, but I don't think they were quite equipped. And I think I was probably like the fifth or sixth person that they offered the job to. Same type of story. At least I know of two others that were offered the job and turned down. And I assume that I was down the list because I had no experience. Like I'd never done any of this stuff. Uh, the only advantage I had was some of them knew me. They knew I would work hard. Uh, but it was really just a time of tremendous growth where they went from kind of mom and pop shop to like, hey, we need to like, we're messing out. We need to formalize some things. We need more resources. So in some respects, it was great because it was like a green field, right? I could kind of do whatever, and it was easy to have success because they were building from very little. Uh, and the people there are fantastic. Like Mike Roth he just recently retired, was a great athletic director because he kind of gave some boundaries and then said like, you know, here's some things I'm uncomfortable with in general. Go to work,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was great. Um, so they kind of had it was in some ways a really awesome experience to kind of ride the wave up, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so as you get into that, you started thinking about teaching, or you had someone that was in teaching. How did that come about? And then obviously talk about transitioning to Oklahoma State and getting to Oklahoma State.
Yeah, some of it was so I'm athletics because you coach, it's all consuming, right? So and then you go into fundraising, it's the same thing because so I was doing marketing too. So like you have women's volleyball on a Thursday and Saturday all fall. Then you have soccer on like Friday night and Sunday. So pretty soon you're just working all the time, which is all like it's fine. That's what I do. So that's what I did. But when you like step back, like, hey, I'm starting to miss things that are important to me, right? Like I couldn't go to a friend's wedding. And I probably could have, said, hey guys, like someone else could do this job for a day, but it just wasn't in my mindset at the time to like say, hey, this is important. You
Mm-hmm.
start missing family stuff, right? Or you're like, Thanksgiving becomes just the day of Thanksgiving because you're like, hey, I got to get back from work, right?
Yeah.
So some of that stuff just kind of was in my mind. Like, is this really how I'm going to spend the next? And there's nothing wrong with those that do that. It's a true passion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it just wasn't for me. I loved Gonzaga. I loved sports, but I didn't want to spend every weekend, doing women's soccer. I didn't really like the fundraising part. I just didn't like asking people for money.
Mm-hmm.
So I was starting to think, okay, well, what do I do next? And honestly, I saw a lot of my professors at Gonzaga like playing noon ball a couple days a week, rolling into campus at 10. Looks like a pretty good job. Uh, so yeah, it was really just kind of hey, I'm going to try this for 2 years. Worst case, I'll have a degree, I'll learn something, then I'll pivot again. Because as you know, too, sports you don't really make a lot of money, so it wasn't like I wasn't giving up a lot of money to,
Sure.
right? Like, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important too, as talk back and see your story a little bit in the coaching world and then fundraising. Athletics is all consuming to some extent for sure, and so there's a lot of sacrifices to be made whenever you're in athletics. And so one thing that I think about is understanding, what do you value? What are the
yeah,
things that you value? Why do you value it? And then weighing those things out, the pros and the cons, and figuring out what's the right fit for you. Because you do have to have passion. You got to love what you do. And so the ones that really do and they want to be in those roles, they'll continue to work towards that, and they're going to make sacrifices because of it.
yeah.
So just understanding what do you value and why do you value it is really key. And obviously you came to that point and started to transition into teaching. And so talk about Oklahoma State. You moved from from Washington all the way down to the Midwest, middle of nowhere. It seems like probably Stillwater. And
Yeah.
so, what was that like?
So one thing is like there's words that mean different things in different regions, right? So
Sure.
like very early on, I was like, "Hey, do you guys want to like come over for a barbecue?" And people are like, "You have a like you barbecue?" Like, yeah. And I was just like flipping burgers, right? And they're like, "Oh no, like a barbecue is a thing, like
Yeah.
right, ah, I don't know. Like it's an entire cuisine, right?" So I think that was maybe like the second weekend when I was in Stillwater. Like I'm just flipping some burgers for some buddies. And they're like, "Oh, like we call a barbecue like where you smoke meat." And okay. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, but no, some of those little things are funny. And it's a different way of life. Like I used to call it lunch hour and a half in Stillwater because like no one was in a hurry, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, can you take my order? like, which is awesome. Like I loved that about Stillwater. It's super friendly. Uh, so some of those cultural things are funny. But yeah, I lucked out. I feel like everywhere. So I've moved a handful of times. So I've moved to Reno from Stillwater, then back to Stillwater. But kind of every time I've moved, so I moved to a different high school. I moved from junior high, went to different high school and found awesome friends. Went to college. Most of the time you don't know anyone, found awesome friends. Went to Oklahoma and found awesome friends. Like there are great people everywhere. Uh, and I think sometimes, you know, people are like, "Hey, I don't want to move because of that," or it's a deterrent, right? But uh, I've just been really fortunate and lucky to realize that, man, there are really awesome people everywhere. And there are awesome people in Stillwater. What a more, it's a super inviting, welcoming place, very family oriented kind of feel. So immediately fell in with, and I was joined a PhD program. So you're immediately like, you're on a team again, right? Like there's a group of, at that time, say there were 8 PhD students, and we all kind of have the same goal. We're doing it a little different, but we're all kind of going through these steps together, which was just awesome. So the group I went through with, I still am in touch with all of them. Um, so kind of lucked out that I also lucked out that we all kind of had similar interests. Like not all of them were into sports at the level I was, but we all were reasonably into sports. Uh, you know, all like to maybe go have a beer occasionally. So just kind of fell into a good group of people too, which is great.
Yeah, and I think my story can ring true to that as well. It's just whenever you go somewhere, I've been blessed with having great friends, but your point is that there's great people everywhere. And so taking those steps outside your comfort zone, pushing into a new experience, and finding people and building relationships that have value is really critical, just to life. And it's critical just to the enjoyment of life. Spending time
Yeah.
with people and having friends that really matter is really important.
I think maybe that's one thing we certainly have in common, but maybe that's one thing that sports teaches you too, right? Like you join a basketball team and you're gonna like there's a guy on your team who you absolutely don't want to hang out with outside of the team, but you get to know him, you're like, this guy's all right. Like, we have basketball in common and come to appreciate his style a little bit. I think that's a great part of team sports that you learn, maybe this person who you didn't initially know well, you come to know and like obviously there's jerks everywhere too, but you know,
Sure.
once you're open to kind of, hey, it's this guy has some weird quirks, but he's a great guy, right? Or I
Yeah.
didn't know he was a great guy because I wasn't open to him before. I think
Yeah,
sports is great for that.
absolutely. And I think just being around people, I mean, I still have friends that I've met just from being on the opposite team,
Yeah,
just playing
absolutely.
against people so much, right? So those are just amazing ways to connect with different people. And there's also obviously like being in the band, you can do all these different things in life,
Yeah.
but just developing relationships and through these experiences, they help shape us and grow.
Now remind
So
me, did you go to Holland Hall?
I did in Tulsa.
So
Yep.
did they probably had a like kind of a liberal arts education model where you had to do like a little dabble in everything?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that mentality for sure, and then obviously at Furman, that's very much the same too in
Yeah.
South Carolina. So yeah, you had kind of that broad array of things that you're doing. Like photography is one thing I did at
Yeah.
Oakland or at Holland Hall.
which is like a totally different group of people that are into that, right? Than traditionally than that are into basketball. So you like
Yes,
learn this, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
And two, going to that point, I think, going to a smaller school that's more that mindset, you also like, we wound up getting into show choir, ironically. And, I look back and, sometimes at the moment I was like, I didn't want to tell people that. But at the same time, like now it's like, I'm okay. I'm okay with myself to say that. But
yeah,
you learn a lot through those experiences, whether or not they're the same things that you've continually done over time. It's just something new. It's different. You
yeah,
meet different people and you have these things that shape you. And it's just a really fun part of life. And it's something to remember moving forward.
yeah. I really value those, the kind of the liberal arts model, for lack of a better term, or the like. And my parents did a good job of kind of forcing me. Like I played piano when I was a kid. And I always felt like a nerd, right? Like those experiences, the people you meet are and just broaden your horizons. Uh, you don't even realize it at the time, but just a different way of learning, a different right exposure. And so I really,
Absolutely.
really value that stuff.
And like we talked about before, just finding out what you value, you can't figure that out until you have these experiences, And I think
Absolutely.
doing all types of different things, especially at a young age, if you can, you get a taste of everything. And then as
Yeah.
you kind of learn more about it and you dive into it, like then that's great. But having these experiences help you understand what you're getting yourself into. And it's all right if you get into something and pivot into something else. But
Yeah.
just having these things is really important. I agree
I
100%.
totally agree. Yeah.
So, and transitioning that into academic life. So, how did you go about getting into obviously leadership? You're in management. You did marketing. You had that background behind yourself. And so, what are some things that you've learned along the way as a professor and just teaching students, and then talking about leadership development, management of people and business, all these different things?
Yeah. So I think maybe you can appreciate this being in sports. Like it's a weird dichotomy when you're working your way up the ladder. Like you want someone to be fired, right? Like, hey, you're at Furman and you need the guy at South Carolina to get fired. So your guy can get the job and either like you can move with them or you can move up. Uh, so kind of studying that process of, how do people move exposes you to a lot of different, like there is no one path, right? Which then kind of raises questions like, okay, if there is no one path, like how do people get where they're at? So that's kind of where I went in academics. So the things you're talking about are things like I constantly think about, like how do I boil down, like if I'm trying to give, because you got to boil things down, right? You got to like there are 100 things, but how do you get it to 3 or 5 to give people some lessons? And I don't think as a society we're there yet. We're not in academia, right? There's so many things that matter, or in the study of leadership, right? So these like the one thing, even the 3 things, like, hey, can we broaden that? Like, uh, so I think about this all the time, and I don't have a great answer. So I'm always curious of what others say. Like, what are the core lessons? But I have, since you kind of asked, I've been thinking about it, and I've thought about this a lot. And I keep trying to refine my answer. I think we've hit on one is kind of knowing what you value, knowing yourself. So that's one. So whenever people ask me like, hey, career advice, or I generally start with like that, like, what are you trying to get? Like, it's path dependent. If you're trying to get money, that's a different thing than if you're trying to get a really flexible job, right? Like, eventually they may come together, but like pursue it. You pursue a path, and that path precludes other paths. So kind of knowing, start with the end in mind, kind of thing. So what are you trying to get? That's a tough question because how do you answer that at age 20, right? Or even how do I answer it at age 40? Like, what am I trying to get? I think about that all the time, and it changes, right? Like,
Sure.
I just had a kid, so now it's changed in the last year. Like now, what I'm trying to get is to make sure that I can provide her with the things that I was provided, and make sure I'm available. And like, it's what if I died tomorrow, right? Like, it just things change. But some acknowledgement of that. And the other thing that I try and stress with people is, and I call it independence, and I don't know if that's the right word, but I think we spend a lot of our time worried about what other people think. And you kind of mentioned this, like, hey, I'm secure enough to say that I was in show choir. Like
Yeah.
that's a big moment, right? Like the fact that you're okay saying that, because I don't know, you like how long did you hide it for, right? Like um, so, and that's just one example, but being independent of, maybe what your parents will think. And that's not to say like don't take their advice, but that's to say like, if they have this path in mind for me, but that's not my path, being independent enough in your own thinking to say like, no, I'm like, this is what I want to do. And I've thought about it. And that's a tough boundary, because if like 5 or 6 people you care about are all telling you it's a bad idea, it might be a bad idea, right?
Sure.
But being independent of how you carry yourself, like, some people might think you're weird because you wear a Nike hat. Or like, well, this is who I am, and be comfortable enough that in your own skin to say like, no, this is who I am. I think we're so malleable as people early on in our life that we're worried about, are we making this friend happy? Are we making, and we don't make ourselves happy, right? And like, so those are really two things that I like. What are you trying to get? And are you worried about external influence that maybe you shouldn't be worried about? Maybe we could all empathize with like FOMO, right? We've all had that feeling. Uh, People are worried about us when we're not there, and chances are they really aren't, right? They're
Sure.
worried about what they're doing at that moment. Like whether you're there or not, they're going to have fun playing golf. Like they may
Yeah.
want you there, but they're not like obsessing about you not being there, right? Some of those, so yeah, I call it kind of just independence. Like, are you willing to make the decisions for who you are rather than, you know being influenced by others?
Yeah, and how would you say, based upon your experiences of studying these types of things, of talking about these types of things, how do people develop that?
I don't know. So I struggle with this too, because I'm not certain that I have it mastered. In fact, I'm certain that I don't, because maybe you can empathize with this one too. There are decisions in your life, and you try and articulate them, right? Like I'm trying to articulate this in a nice way, but it comes across too direct, right? Or comes across maybe dismissive of the other person. Uh, so like that maybe is the extreme view of independence, right? Like I shudder to use this example, but like if you've watched The Good Doctor, or like someone where they maybe do a spin on autism, where the people are like so pure in how they think that they don't worry, right? There's like, this is who I am. Uh, like the lack of social processing is totally refreshing, but can cause problems, right? Like, hey, you can be too direct, or you can be too like, no, this is who I am, too much. So there's a balance, right? And finding that right balance of being appropriately independent while also, being reasonably accommodating to other people is difficult. It's
Hmm.
like, hey, does anyone want to do this thing that has to be done, but that you don't want to do? Like, no one wants to do it, right? Like that Vince Vaughn movie. You should want to put the dishes away. Like, why would I want to do that, right? Like, I'm willing to empty the dishwasher, but like, I don't want to. I would rather do something else. So there's that balance. So I don't know that I have mastered it by any means. In fact, I'm confident that I haven't, but I do try and reflect on that point fairly routinely. Like, am I making a decision for the right reasons, or am I making it because I'm worried about what someone else will think?
Hmm.
And if it's the latter one, um, that can be a kind of a dangerous area, right? Like, you got to worry about what other people will think a little bit, because you have to be like, hey, everyone has to sacrifice a little to help the team, but uh, kind of that gray area is tough to navigate. So constantly something I reflect on.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of it goes down to being true to yourself, understanding who you are as a person, having
Yeah,
confidence in that, but also having humility to not be overly confident and arrogant,
right.
is really critical to that, I would think.
Yeah. So were you part of the Dare, like Say No to Drugs campaign? Or was that like, there's like a few year period where they had Dare, right?
Okay, yeah, I
Um,
think I might have remember hearing about
yeah,
that.
it was like a nationwide, like how basically trying to teach you how to say no, right, in appropriate ways.
Okay.
And it's that balance because you can't say no to everything, right? Like, because then that's like, will be counter cyclical. You'll eventually have no friends and it'll lead you to drugs, right? So like,
Sure.
dare turned out being this like weird, like it taught people to be social loners in some ways, right? Whether there's evidence of that, but that was one of the counter arguments, right? Like, so finding that right balance of being true to yourself to make good decisions without going to the extreme is really a life lesson for a lot of things: drugs, exercise, alcohol abuse, being obsessed with your phone, being, you know, anything you do to an extreme that then, you know, is detrimental to other aspects of your life. Some, you know, something I by no means like. I probably use my cell phone too much, right? Like, hey, I'm sitting here and my wife's trying to talk to me and I'm looking at baseball scores. Like,
Sure.
okay, you're a little out of balance. Like, you're now, you know, you're beholden to your phone.
Yeah.
So at least it's a point I try and reflect on.
Yeah. And another point I think that you brought out just a little bit ago is kind of simplicity from that perspective, where, you know, there's so many things, but trying to boil things down and make them simple and concise, because there's so many ways that we can go. But if we have some principles or some things that we focus on that keep us down the right path, whichever path that might be for each person,
Yeah.
is really important as well.
Yeah, we're all going to veer off, right? I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
like, no one's perfect.
Yeah. And I'll throw this at you too, because I think this is one that, you know, I'm still obviously learning, growing, whatnot, but I'm an avid reader. I listen to a lot of different people, talking with people all the time. Like I love that type of environment. And so one of the things that I've thought about a lot is that when you boil it down to some questions, because I think you can't say this and make it general for everybody. I think if you ask questions, that gets to each individual and hits them differently, right? And
Absolutely.
so there's three things that I've thought about a lot that I think are really, you know, critical to direction, success, and understanding yourself. But it's just, what do you want? Why do you want it? And what are you going to do to get it? And
Yeah, that's a
evaluating those
really,
questions.
yeah, that's pretty simple and
Yeah. And it's not, it is simple, but it also is complex, right? As we think
yeah,
about and process those things. But as you talked about, just having a path to go down, it's okay to pivot. It's better to have a target and then move the target. Just having a goal that you're working towards and going in a
yeah,
certain direction. If it moves, it moves. But just having that in front of you to keep pressing forward into those things. And now I'd rather have something in front of me than just kind of wandering aimlessly,
yeah,
personally.
absolutely.
And so I think that's really important too. But I just was curious what you thought about that, because those are some things that I found. If you can answer those questions, typically people can have a better appreciation for each and every day and be more present. You know, a common theme in the podcast is, you know, be where your feet are. And so just being in the
Yeah,
moment. And that's really critical too. Um,
that's
so
really critical.
yeah, but you know, it's simple, but not so simple, right?
Right. Yeah,
So
totally.
yeah. So going into, you know, what you're doing now, you're at the University of Florida, teaching, and talk about leadership and management. What are some things and some characteristics that make a great leader, manager, business person that you found based upon your time of being around?
Yeah. So same thing, trying to boil it down, right?
Sure.
So I spend so same with you. So maybe one thing we could add to our list is being open to learn, right? Like, hey, I spend a lot of time reading and thinking, and that's really powerful. I would assume that that's a really good trait of leaders. Although I, off the top of my head, unaware of, I guess personality would be openness, maybe openness to experience. Uh, but that's really powerful that you would say that because I spend a lot of time asking. Basically, the thing you're doing with this podcast is awesome because I spend a lot of time successful people I know like, how'd you get here, right? Like, how do you boil it down? How do I find you before, you know, if I'm looking for a doctoral student, how do I find Bailey Miles? How do I find, you know, the grinder that is also a good person? And,
Mm-hmm.
so I spend a lot of time thinking about that since I study leadership too, or executive leadership. I find it like how do I find what's made people like, why is Mark Few successful? Why is some of the people you've had on in politics or in, ministers or business, like, why are they successful? I don't know that we can boil it down to any even handful of things. I like your three. I wrote that down because I think that's good questions to ask. But if then we answered them, I don't know that we could even like, because it's so different, right? It's path dependent. Uh,
Mm.
but I do think some commonalities that I've found in people is one, you have to be willing to work. Like work ethic is like table stakes, right? So there's a study by I think it was some Harvard people, and they actually tracked executives over like a 10-year period, right? And they found like knowledge and work ethic, like those are like they're given. So they're like not even factors because people who don't have them don't even get into this pool of people, right? So like we can't even really estimate that because like they're estimated out. So yeah, a baseline knowledge, obviously, in what you do, but the ability to work hard, I think can't be underestimated. So I
Hmm.
think rarely will you see a successful leader that doesn't have a solid work ethic. And then one thing that we've touched on kind of indirectly throughout this is kind of being authentic to yourself, who you are. So in leadership, they call it authentic leadership, right? If you're a brusque person, but you're like authentically brusque, right? Like that's who you are, and people know what to expect. Uh, that's better than being malleable in terms of not being consistent, right? So hopefully that authentic person is a good, caring person. Uh, but just knowing who you are and being that is important. I haven't seen a lot of evidence on the being open to learn, but I think in some way, like the world's changed so much, right? Like think about our childhood, and in the grand scope of life, that's a pretty small leap of time. But like the world is so different, right? We now with cell phones, with technology. What's the world going to look like post COVID? Uh,
Yeah.
so like change is constant. You have to be willing to kind of reinvent and
And have that openness like you talked about.
yeah. So I would say those are kind of some key factors
Hmm.
that I've
And
kind of. So I have notes in my phone that I constantly update, and so those are things that I've written down over time.
yeah, and as you go through and you have these programs that work with executive leaders, what are you helping them do when they're coming into your program?
So I think a few things are number one, a little bit of self-actualization. Like I'm not a psychologist, but at least knowing who you are and knowing your own proclivities. So there's a competency trap, right? Like people who get to a certain level of success have gotten there for a reason, but that's not always a good thing, right? Like so if we go back to the Challenger disaster, right? The thing that made the space shuttle blow up had been there for a long time. It just hadn't, right, failed. But the probability of its failing was pretty high. So you kind of have to look at this is still a problem, even though like they had however many launches in a row where it was a problem. Uh, so just starting out with self-actualization, like, hey, these are some biases that I have, rightly or wrongly. I tend to be pretty optimistic. That can be a good trait in a lot of ways, but that can be a bad trait in a lot of ways. So just trying to understand, hey, this is who you are, and then trying to understand some basic influencers, right? Whether they're so we kind of block it up into four, like who you are is one, the situation you're in. So if somebody dangles a bunch of money in front of you, that may change your behavior, right? So just trying to understand external motivators, and then the people you're around. That's a big one. And then fourth is just the context. So are you in a situation that allows you to kind of keep having this competency trap, or are you in a situation where you've systematically put things in place to slow you down and make good decisions? Uh, so what happens? You get someone on like Elon Musk, right? He's clearly brilliant. He's had a lot of success, but then he's in a situation where there's no one really slowing him down, and that can be really problematic.
Mm.
Uh, so if you've watched Tesla's stock price, right, like huge tank. Now it's back up. But then last week he was in trouble again. You're like, this is a pattern. Um, not to pick on Elon Musk, but like this is a pattern of someone who's obviously brilliant, but is in a situation where there's no checks and balances in place.
Yeah,
It's hard for us to like rein. Who wants to put checks and balances on ourselves, right? But understanding the importance of that. So that's kind of like a common model, in, I guess, in uh, executive kind of walk through those like, I won't worry about money. Well, you say that until, right?
sure.
So trying to just walk through the evidence of, what do we know about this so we can hopefully avoid it in the future.
Absolutely. And what you just talked about are great things to ask yourself and understand about yourself as well. And having a system of checks and balances in place, or having a person that can help you essentially be a checks and balances type person for you. Speaking what you talked about at an early age, your dad and the people around you, speaking a little bit of truth, Grace, kind of keeping you in check and getting
Yeah.
you going in the right direction. So I know we got to get out of here in just a second. So I want to dive right into the fire round real quick.
Yeah. You
Well, I'll
bet.
just go ahead and say something. You can finish it with a word or a sentence. So you can do anything if.
Uh, is the start of a really bad sentence, right? Because the answer is if you put your mind to it, right? We've learned that for a long time, and I don't think that's the best advice. Like I can't play in the NBA, I can't play Major League Baseball. Um, so yeah, I think is a statement we should use carefully, maybe.
Okay, awesome. Diligence is
Careful and persistent effort.
favorite vacation spot.
Oh man, you'll appreciate this. It has to be Sydney, Australia, right? I mean,
Yes,
it's
yes.
magical for you, but it's just a magical place.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Learning means
Uh, Learning means, I would just say acquiring knowledge, which I guess could be a skill, but constantly acquiring new insights.
favorite basketball or academic experience.
Oh man, so I was part of that Elite Eight team at Gonzaga, and I would say, is that the favorite? And part of it, we were so naive at the time, like didn't necessarily appreciate it as much as I should. So I look back and like totally positive, but I wasn't as in the moment maybe as I should have been, or it was like I didn't realize how powerful that was. Uh, but I would say probably the last game that I personally played is probably one of my favorites,
Awesome.
just because it's more salient for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It all comes down to
Wow, too many things, right? We've touched on so many on this. I guess I would say, if I had to say one thing, I would say being true to yourself.
yeah, that's great. So we're done with the fire round. Is there a
Okay.
certain piece of best advice you've ever received?
So I'm like a quote person and an advice person. So my phone is like overwhelmed with little bits of knowledge. Like I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Like
Yeah.
string them together. Like maybe I need to make a quilt. Like little sayings. I don't know. So I don't know if there's I don't know if there's one best piece of advice that I've received. One that I think about a lot is maybe this is too long of a story. So I wasn't like a big partier in high school, but I went to a party and I wasn't drinking. But I came home and my dad said, where were you? And of course, I lied to him. And he said, oh, that's funny because these people called and said that you were there. Busted, right? And then he went into this whole like story about, you shouldn't lie. But the thing that resonated the most with me about it is like, if you're going to accept uh, that of yourself, then like who am I? I was a senior in high school. Like, hey, you're an adult now. Like who am I to tell you that if that's what you want to accept uh, for how you behave, then you're an adult. Like accept that. Which is like it's this ultimate arrow, right? Like I know it's wrong, but the best piece of advice is what you accept is what you get, right? So like, if you're willing to accept whatever it is, like that's what you get, or better start working your way out of it. Which I loved your third point is how are you going to get out of it, right? So if you accept lying, you're a liar, right? If you accept suboptimal effort, you're a suboptimal effort person. So it's resonated with me in a lot of times. Like, yeah, I just lied. Should I have done that? Even if it's kind of a white lie. Like, well, you start accepting that. That's who you are. So I think about that moment a lot in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great story and a great piece of advice. Well, this podcast is called Building Excellence. What does building excellence mean to you?
Yeah, so I have a recency bias here because I really liked the three things that you said. Like if you did those, if you really knew what you wanted and you had a solid reason of why you wanted it, and you were taking proactive steps, like man, that's excellence in some ways. I mean, you could be, say, you're someone with severe physical limitations, but like you're doing the best you can on those three things. That's pretty powerful. So man, I'm stealing your thunder in some ways. Uh, but boiling it down, I think excellence is doing what you want to do to the best of your ability, all things considered, right? Like
Mm.
sometimes we have time limitations and we have to maybe cut some corners that we don't want to, but that's life. Uh, but yeah, doing the best that you can with all variables considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aaron, I just want to say thanks for coming on the show. For people that didn't ever get to know the background of how we became friends, is that I was in college trying to get into coaching, wound up coming across you via just being my college counselor. She said, "I think if you're getting into coaching, I think there's a guy who used to coach at Gonzaga or something." And so from there we met. I think you probably are the sole person aside from God that we can thank for Chandler and I's relationship, because you talked me
Yeah,
into going to the Australia trip. So
yeah,
this is the
that's good.
guy. This is the guy
Yeah,
behind the trip that talked me into it, and got some buddies to go, and obviously met Chandler there. And
yeah,
so,
that's where you met. So, hey, I'll
so
take that. That's awesome.
yeah. But anyway, just thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your story, your experiences, the things that you've learned along the way, the things that you impart to people every single day as you
Thank
teach.
you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to. Man, I saw your slate of guests. Like, wow, it's cool that I'm part of it. But
Absolutely, yeah.
really appreciate what you're doing, man. This is if we help one person, right? If something that one of these podcasts gets out and helps one person or two people or three people, like that's pretty powerful. So good on you for
Absolutely.
doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if someone wanted to follow you or learn more about you, or what's the best way to follow you or get in touch?
So I'm like on social media, but I post very rarely. And usually it's like just funny insights, hopefully funny or
Okay.
ironic insights. But hey, just shoot me an email. Like I'm at University of Florida, so Google Aaron Hill, University of Florida. Always happy to connect with people and talk about mutual interests. So yeah, thanks for having me on. This is
Awesome.
great.
Thanks for being on the show.